This is PatZi with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And boy, oh boy, do I have a story behind today's book. It is so amazing, and I am so happy to welcome Mike Bond to Joy on Paper. And I don't know. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Patsy.
You have been called the existential thriller writer, but sometimes I think you're the existential threat to lots of.
Yeah, well, that's what CRUDE is about, is the existential threat. And it was BBC that years ago, several years ago, said I was what did they call me? Anyway, the existentialist thriller is what they said I
What they
wrote.
what?
And which to me, Patsy, just means that I try to deal with real things, real dangers, real life, and not with trivialities.
Exactly, and it's some people call it sort of guerrilla writing, where you're writing about real things that you want people to really know about, and you write them in a way that people can grasp, which is important because you people aren't going to read textbooks, that's for sure. But yet your
Yeah.
books are filled, oh, the amazing things that you have written about, including Africa, which I will talk a little bit later on about your books about that feature Africa. And of course, I love elephants, so I've been very fond of that. But let's talk a little bit here. Now we're going to start with CRUDE. And there was a subtitle: Ukraine, war, nuclear threats. I don't know, so many things happening in this world. But this is a relevant book, and it's particularly relevant at this time when so many things are happening in the world. And I thought that first of all, I want to use one of your. I love anybody who quotes Montaigne. So nothing is so firmly believed as what we least know, and that is so true. People don't know enough sometimes, and it's wonderful to be able to learn from your writing because you just make everything come alive. I'm going to talk about your characters. You have characters in that absolute tradition of old time thrillers that they are so relatable and so memorable. So we're going to talk about those. But I thought first, why don't you explain a little bit? Oh, there's another little quote there. Do you know who wrote that one?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's from one of my poetry books, and that is certainly my own experience. Once you know war, you will never know peace. And once you've been in a war, it sticks to you like napalm. You never get it off. And I have a very high level of PTSD, and I just learned to live with it, but it keeps you up at night.
Yep, it certainly does. And so we're talking today about crude. Most people don't know too much about crude. They know it's oil somewhere, something, and it's in some places. Of course, we're talking today particularly about offshore crude, but here's a little map showing where you find all of this.
Yeah,
And you've been to
the
most of the
darker
places.
I've been to just about every place on that map and in a very complicated and dangerous life. But if looking at that map, Patsy, as you would be the first to point out, the darker the area, the greater presence of crude oil in under the ground. And the uh, benefit of crude oil, it's a double-edged sword in that it can lead to a certain amount of wealth in countries, but it also can lead to autocracies, dictatorships, and revolutions and enormous human suffering. So it works both ways. But just briefly about crude oil, it always fascinated me because it was something. Here you have this dark, tarry substance that comes out of the ground, and looking at that little chart you have to the right side of the paper here, this and crude oil is very different in many different locations. There's heavy crude and light crude, for instance. Saudi Arabia and most of the Middle East is blessed with what's called light crude, which is much easier to refine and turn into gasoline and some of the better products. When I say better, the more widely needed products in the world, principally gasoline and various other substances that are used even for the making of plastics and other things. But looking at this, you can see that crude when it goes to a refinery, it gets split into many different products. Kerosene, for instance, which is similar to jet kero, which is what our planes fly, petrol, which is becomes various types of gasoline. And it if you look at that little chart there, what's called the bottom of the barrel is the heavy part of the crude molecule, and it leads to fuel oil, which is also bunker fuel, which is used in most ships. And it tends to be far less flammable, far less energy rich. When you get to petrol, gasoline, that is extremely energy rich, and we can get a lot of use out of a gallon of gasoline, for instance, much more so than a gallon of fuel oil, if you wish.
Now, there are a lot of oil rigs around the world. Many of them, of course, are on land. Most of them are on land, but there are many that are offshore.
Right.
And this is an oil rig.
Hmm. Yeah,
So,
it's very similar to the one I described at the beginning of Crude, and that one, which is in the South China Sea, is actually similar to the one that I worked on years ago, which was owned by Total Energies, the French oil company. I live in France most of the time now, and I'm very closely involved with the French government as well as with our own government. But yeah, that's an on-land oil rig and a gas rig, which is slightly different. And most rigs produce both natural gas and crude oil. And that too has a tower for burning off excess natural gas. But that's another matter we don't need to get into. The basis of my book, Crude, is to explain the relationship between crude oil and politics and war because crude oil has been the subject of most of the major wars in the world, even going back to the First World War, which led to attempts by Britain and the United States to take over the oil of the Middle East. And ever since then, uh, crude oil or the presence of oil has led to invasions, CIA takeovers almost endlessly, and multiple wars. And that's where we are now. We're about to have a nuclear war due to the fallacious and unnecessary war that the United States is waging against Russia in Ukraine, which has a great deal of danger for the world right
well,
now.
of course, the story centers on Ross Bullock and Rawhide Energy. So, why don't you
Mhm.
explain? This is a fantastic character. Really, he is one that just once you read about him, you never forget him. It's a great character. And explain about what Ross is trying to do.
Basically, what he did, and again, similar to what I've tried to do as the CEO of a major oil company, Ross was when the war broke out in Ukraine, the proxy war between the United States and Russia. When that broke out, then all countries of the world in the sphere of the Western American led group tried to pass sanctions to cripple the Russian economy. And of course, they backfired. The Russian economy is doing better now than it ever has done before. The ruble has been at an all-time high. It, but what the U.S. when this war broke out, the Biden administration, which had a large hand in setting the war up in the first place, it started with Barack Obama, but expanded into the Biden administration thereafter. That the sanctions which were imposed on Russia, Ross Bullock, the president of the oil company that's Rawhide, which is the center of my book, he refused to comply with these sanctions. He had many operations going in Russia, and he felt, as I worked with the Russians for years, and they're incredibly good people, hardworking, honest, used to be very pro American, and they're trustworthy people, and to malign them as we have done has been immensely dangerous for the world, given that there's 11,000 uh, nuclear weapons shared between the United States and Russia. The difference being that the Russian weapons are faster and more powerful, and that the Russians have a pretty good, if you wish, a anti-nuclear weapon defense system, whereas the United States has none. So if we do end up with a nuclear war, which seems likely at this point, the not only will the world be destroyed and all forms of life larger than cockroaches and bacteria are pretty much done for, the Russians are going to come out of it to the extent that one can come out of it at all. The Russians are going to come out better than the US. But there's no need for this war. There was never any need for this war. And as I said earlier in our program, PatZi, I've been in every corner of Russia, and the people until this war were always incredibly pro-American and very happy to work with Americans any way they could.
Before we get back to the characters of the story, and I love Ross, and I want to talk more about him, about his background, about his where he comes from. But what you just said is very controversial. And in these times, I don't know, do you want to explain? I think one thing perhaps people should know is that you ran for political office back
Mhm.
quite a while ago. And so perhaps you should mention what party you were with at that time.
Yeah, I ran. I, my parents were Democrats, and when I was very young, I was putting out yard signs for Adlai Stevenson. That's how old I am. But yeah, and I've been involved in the Democratic Party for many years. I ran for the U.S. Senate in Montana as a Democrat. After that, I ran in a significant part of Al Gore's presidential campaign. Business Leaders for Gore. I often spoke for the vice president for Al Gore at meetings and debates, and I've supported many Democratic candidates. I gave so much money to Barack Obama in his first race that my wife and I were invited to a special dinner of his leading contributors. And the trouble was, it was in January, and we were at our home in Hawaii. And the last thing I wanted to do was leave sunny, warm Hawaii and go to a snowstorm in Washington, D.C. So we never went to the Barack Obama's first dinner for his major contributors. But it Barack Obama is the man who then chased me out of the Democratic Party as the Democratic Party continued to evolve into something that does not represent what Democrats used to be.
You worked for Al Gore. You were
Hmm.
deeply involved, I think, and as Al Gore is deeply involved in all of these new energy, green energy
Yeah,
programs,
right. Most
including,
of which don't work. Excuse
yeah,
me, I interrupted you, Patsy, please, and you were saying including?
including windmills.
Oh
Um,
God, oh God, that is such a fraud. Windmills are. Uh, they I've done as a former CEO of an energy company, I have a pretty good background in all of this. And I've actually done an analysis of windmills and the amount of final power that they provide to the market is 4% of what their backers say that they provide. They are phenomenally destructive to birds and bats. They're very destructive to visual values. They're horrendous to look at. They destroy property values. Nobody with a windmill in sight can sell their property. Many ways to deal with climate warming, which is a real issue, but windmills are not going to be one of them. Much more useful. And it's so silly. If you put a barrel in painted black with on your roof, on the side of the roof that faces toward the sun, you will have hot water, and you don't need to heat it in a in you don't have to put a water heater in the basement, or you can put a little booster on it to keep it warm at night. But given that hot water is generally about 35% of our total electricity bill, you can see the enormous amount of difference that you can make with a tiny change.
See, there you have it wrong because I will tell you this is absolutely impossible. Because did you know in California it is illegal to capture rainwater? My cousin
Yeah, no,
landed up in court because
no kidding.
he wanted to water his garden, so he had a barrel that filled up with
Yeah,
water. He was, let's say, the city nearly took his house away. So you cannot take that. That doesn't belong to you. If it comes out of the sky,
yeah.
it doesn't belong to you. But let's get back
No,
to the
I,
book. Yeah, no,
you
what?
know, I misspoke, Patsy. I'm not talking about a barrel out of the water. I'm saying that you
No,
pump water into the barrel that's sitting on your roof, and that'll heat your water
yeah, no, I
without
know,
your
I
having
know.
to. Yeah, please go
I'm
ahead.
I'm being facetious, but
Yeah.
we cannot, according to everybody nowadays, rainwater doesn't belong to us anymore, which is funny.
That's in California.
It's in California.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's why we're talking about crude, because crude is necessary. I'm sorry, people. I don't really want to have an airplane that's running on oil from McDonald's. I would like to know that my airplane is running on something really great. So we need crude, and for a long time to come. So here we have Ross Bullock, Rawhide Energy, and he comes from, tell us his background, because he wasn't rich when he started. He
No.
started from the bottom. So explain about Rawhide.
He grew up, Ross Bullock grew up in North Dakota and then went to school in Montana at Montana State, which is a great university in Bozeman. And he grew up in the oil fields of North Dakota. His dad was a wildcat operator, which is somebody who installs a few oil wells and tries to expand the production of oil off them. It's a tough, very tough business and very competitive, but that's where he started, and then he went on at Bozeman at the university at Montana State. He fell in love with astrophysics, and which I love also, and became very preoccupied with getting us off this little rock, as he called it. And he went to Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California, to work on ways of getting us off this little rock. And then his father died, and he had a choice: does he come back and take over the family business, which is a small oil production company, or does he let it go to pieces? So he went back and took over the company and turned it in a number of years into one of the largest and most powerful energy companies in the world, with substantial holdings in not only oil, but pipelines, natural gas, even uranium. 7% of the world's uranium supply, because it was his belief, again, returning to the earlier subject we talked about briefly, which is climate warming and the need for oil. In the long run, what's going to save us is nuclear energy. And because nuclear energy has no climate impact whatsoever and is extremely efficient, not too expensive. In some countries, like where I live most of the time, is France, and France is largely run by nuclear energy, and there's never been a problem in years. There's 58 nuclear plants, never been a problem. And they sell their power all over Europe, their nuclear power. This is another of Ross's points: is that we have to diversify substantially into nuclear power. But when he went and challenged the Biden administration on the sanctions and said, no, I'm not going to stop working with the Russians. They're fair, they're good partners, they're hardworking, they're honest. The Biden administration, in my book, responded by starting a worldwide attack on Rawhide, uh, which involved first blowing up a this oil platform in the South China Sea, similar to the one I used to work on, and from there attacking a Wyoming refinery. And it wasn't necessarily excuse me, it's not the Biden administration so much as what I keep pointing out is the U.S. war machine. And that's what the real subject of my book is: the U.S. war machine, which is we spend more money on making weapons to kill people than the next 11 countries combined. Um, and we are basically at war with Russia, and we spend 12 times as much money per day trying to kill people as they do. In the United States, for instance, due to the war machine, which runs a good part of our Congress through every form of, and also our media, as well as the CIA, which is just a front for the war machine. That war machine has been the cause of many horrible wars, many of them for the purpose of taking over oil supplies. And uh, underneath all of our attack on Russia, which is criminal, is the fact that we want their oil. They have enormous reserves, as you pointed out in that map that you recently showed, and that the long range goal of the United States war machine, the Central Intelligence Agency, the State Department, etc., the long-term goal is to somehow split up Russia and get our hands on the oil and gas reserves in many of the areas of Russia. So as
Well,
I point that out in Crude also, please go ahead. Yeah,
exactly.
I'm
Now,
sorry.
no, no. Liz, one of the characters is Liz Chaplin, and
Yeah,
she's a senior geologist, and so um, she comes into the book in a big boom, let's say.
yeah,
So it's the beginning of where Ross starts to understand that he is being sabotaged. There are
yes,
powers out there to get rid of him, and of course, Liz is one of the characters, and she's caught right in the middle of it. A great character, and I was reminded. I know that, of course, she's an engineer and a senior geologist, and your wife, I think, is an engineer. You mentioned.
yes. Yeah, Liz, to a large degree, I don't want to say she's patterned on my wife, but my wife is a engineer and undersea explorer and computer scientist as well. She lived for 2 weeks underneath the ocean in a habitat as the senior engineer in this undersea habitat when she was 22 years old. And that was preparation to go on and become an astronaut. She decided she did not want to become an astronaut. We ended up getting married, and that was much more fun. Uh,
Yes.
so, anyway, so to a certain extent, Liz is very smart. She knows what she's talking about, and she doesn't suffer fools gladly.
She's a great character, really great. I could
Thank
see
you very
she's based on your wife, I think. A really wonderful character. And now, when Ross, of course, now realizes as things go boom in the night in many places that
Yeah,
he's in trouble. There are forces out to get him or get rid of him, actually.
yep,
And in comes another character. I love this character, Lily.
yeah. Lily is an Asian, she's Chinese, and she works for the New York Times in most of the book. She's a senior journalist for the New York Times. And I use her also to explain what's wrong with the New York Times. In some ways, I consider the New York Times to be America's worst newspaper. Not only do they frequently lie and misrepresent and refuse to cover things which are true, but they have such an enormous impact because they're so believed that they do enormous harm. Lily has her battles with the New York Times over the fact that she has made it clear in multiple visits to Wuhan in China that obviously COVID came from the Wuhan laboratory that was partially financed by Anthony Fauci and the United States government, and largely financed by the Chinese. And it killed all these people in the world, and yet uh, no one puts any blame on anything. It was entirely created intentionally as a war bacteria. And so Lily in the book starts out as an opponent of Ross Bullock. And she's been told by her editor at the New York Times to take this guy down because the government wants him taken down. And the New York Times works very closely with the United States government. In fact, has a CIA feed that a constant feed of data from the CIA where the CIA basically tells the New York Times what to think and what to tell people to think. When I was younger, I used to think that someday the danger is going to be that we're all going to have a chip in the back of our heads, a computer chip, which is going to tell us what to do and what to think. And it turns out we already do have that, and that is the media. The media has put a little chip in the back of our head. It's not there, but we tend to believe things from the media that are largely untrue. So that's another aspect of my book. I particularly go after the New York Times for its totally irresponsible misrepresentation of reality in many cases.
And of
And
course,
that's Lily's role. Excuse me.
and she
Excuse
plays
me.
it well. She plays it very well. Now, of course, as I said, when things go boom in the night, things really go boom in the night. You have two characters that I just love. It's just sometimes you just fall in love with characters and they stand
Yeah.
out. You have a book and there's lots of characters and they're all great. And then two characters can just take over. And in this case, it's Lyle and Cassidy. So explain who they are. And again, we had another big boom in the night, people sabotaging facilities. And in this case, where are they? And tell us about these characters because I think they steal the show.
I love them too. And Rawhide has, in addition, Rawhide has many facilities. The oil platform in the South China Sea, which blows up, and that's Liz Chapin is the only survivor. You've talked about her, and they also Rawhide also has a refinery in Wyoming, which is a place I know well and love. My wife was born there, as was her mother. Uh, what happens when the refinery blows up by sabotage? First of all, this sheriff in the town of Clearwater, Wyoming, where it happens, he blames Ross. He thinks that they've blown it up for the insurance money. So he immediately, Lyle Brandt, the sheriff, who's about 5'8" and chews tobacco, and has, like Liz Chapin, has no time for foolishness. His sidekick, who's his assistant sheriff, is this black guy who's come in from the southern part of LA because he can't stand it down there anymore, and that's Cassidy. And so Cassidy and Lyle make a 1-2 team. You have this little tobacco chewing Wyoming sheriff, and then this tall, muscular black guy with a broken nose, and they're a wonderful 1-2 team. And one of the things I wanted to point out with Cassidy is that Wyoming and Montana, we don't have much racism in the United States anymore, but we did used to have substantial. But one of the most least racist places in the United States is Wyoming. And people tend to take you for who you are. And I think that's important that we remember that some of the flyover parts of the United States where most people live and where most of the gross national product is created, not the liberal coast, but the places like Montana, Wyoming, Ohio, Missouri, etc. These people are the least racist in the United States and the most involved in just living and taking care of each other. And that's one of the things that I wanted to get across with Cassidy because he's a phenomenal character. He's brave, he's smart, and the fact that he's black, as one point Lyle and he are talking about, the people in Wyoming, it kind of ticks Lyle off that Cassidy, being black, is more trusted by the people in Wyoming than the white guys. And that's the way things are. Black people are very, very highly trusted and believed in rural Montana, rural Wyoming, where people take you for who you are.
Oh, and I so gravitated to them every time I ended a section where they were the main characters, and then I read the other ones, and then I kept saying, "When am I going to get back to Lyle and Cassidy?"
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, they're good people. You have characters that you just love because they come from life. And Cassidy and Lyle come from life. And that tough little sheriff, man, the tobacco chewing sheriff, but he's raised a big family of loving children and from rural Wyoming. And Cassidy comes in with another brood of wonderful children that he's moved to Wyoming from Los Angeles to get out of all that mess down there.
And
So they're both good fathers and loving husbands.
yes, that's refreshing because so often people just throw in all these characters who are drunk and miserable, and it's really it's, sometimes you get
Yeah, that's
they,
silly.
they really overdo it. It's always a divorce. The wife doesn't want the ex-husband to see the kids, and the husband drinks or the wife drinks, and I get so bored with that. And then to have two, like sometimes they'll throw in one happily married guy, but to throw in
Yeah,
two happily married guys, I thought, this is
yeah.
brave. I said to myself, oh, this is a brave guy. He must know what it means to be happily married.
Oh, yeah. I, I think most people in the United States and in the world are happily married. And for some reason, as you just pointed out, all the attention gets placed on by writers gets placed on the dysfunctional relationships. And that's why I just believe in people. Most people raise their children happily, and what makes happy people is good parents. And good parents raise good children, and those children go on to be good parents and raise good children. And I don't understand anything about this. You shouldn't have children. You shouldn't have this. Children are the greatest. Well, my own opinion is that one's spouse is the greatest joy in life, and then one's children. And then when you get to my age, you've got this incredible gift of grandchildren. Oh my God, they're so much fun. And to be happy with the people you love is a wonderful gift.
It's nice when people read this because sometimes when it's so negative and there's so much ugliness and fighting and stuff, younger people who might read the book will say, "Oh, that's hopeless. I'm never going to find love. I'm never going to be happily married. I'm never." And so I found it refreshing and I thought, very bold. Isn't it funny that today we have to say it's very bold to have two happily married guys, but I love them. But I love them both.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that because you've read a lot of books. So
I have.
for you to say that is pretty good. I'm pretty grateful. I did want to say one more thing about marriages. Also, Ross Bullock, the president and the CEO of the oil company, he may turn out also to be very happily married. As the book progresses, may Liz Chaplin, excuse me, turn out to be happily married. We don't know. We have to see how it goes. The book evolves quite a bit. And again, returning to what I said before, most people I know, most people in the United States and worldwide, are extremely happily married. And that's another thing, as talking about Russia and the incredible damage that the United States has done to Russia in this made up Ukraine war, is the Russian people are extremely family oriented and they have extensive wide reaching families and are very close with each other. And marriage in Russia is, and having children is considered to be a great gift and one that one is extremely happy to have. So I think that once again, when we have particularly the Democrats trying to make Russia seem evil, I wonder who's really evil. And it's not the Russians.
This is so now the situation is so grim in many ways.
Yeah.
And for you, in many ways, this must be a difficult book for you to promote. Now you've had such wonderful success. As I said, I don't know how many languages your books have been. You speak so many languages. Your other books have been translated into languages. You're well known, but still, this is so nowadays. And we're talking a little bit about. I think you have another poem in your book of poetry, which is called Joy, by the way, which I love, because I
Hmm.
named this program Joy on Paper because
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
a joy
Yeah.
there's the joy of reading, which
Hmm.
enough people don't do. There's the joy of writing because it's so exciting when you see your words on paper. And then, of course, the
Yeah.
joy of getting published as you are. But this is a confusing time. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering how you're doing with promoting this book because, again, you have in your book of poetry, you have a poem called Don't Speak the Truth. And I think you exactly talking about this problem that if you are
Yeah.
talking the truth, people will first of all say it's your truth, it's not my truth. And everybody has, they're saying everybody has their own truth, but maybe there is a real truth out there.
Yeah, that poem which you speak of, don't speak the truth and don't say the truth. And my point in the next line, as I recollect, is, and you will be praised. If you don't speak the truth, you will win honors and you will have great success in the world. Because a lot of our society is based on not speaking the truth, and particularly in politics. There is very little truth available in politics. And also in the media is largely the promulgator of false information and makes it very difficult to understand. You said something too just a couple of minutes ago that I wanted to get back to, and that is in writing Crude, which is basically about how the world is descending into a nuclear war and can we stop it. It was extremely difficult to write because every line I wrote, the background is, are we going to have a nuclear war? And when one focuses one's attention on nuclear war and the dangers, which are so explicit and so immediate, which again the media hides, it is very personally depressing. It's wearying. It's exhausting. You can't think about nuclear war without thinking of your own family and thinking of all the people you love and the entire world. And that's why CRUDE is dedicated, the dedication is to all the children that they may live and that Earth survive, because we're in a situation where that may not happen. The Earth may not survive any moment now, particularly with the latest evolutions in this American Russian war in Ukraine. We are on the edge. And in the Middle East, where we have made so many mistakes with Iran over the years, as you and I talked about briefly earlier. We have taken a country that was quite valid and let it, under a number of administrations, let it become a perpetrator of evil. I have friends who are half Iranian, and when their children go back to Iran, it just happened recently. They had a son and a daughter in Tehran. They live in London, but they went back to Iran, and the son was walking on one side of the street with several of his friends, and the daughter was walking on the other side of the street with several of her friends. The daughter wanted some water, and so she called her brother, and he came over and gave her his water bottle, and they were both immediately arrested and put in jail, because there's not supposed to be that kind of contact between male and female.
Uh,
It,
it,
it's
it
insane.
it is insane. And for you and for me, I was in Iran when I was very young, and it was so different. And the same also, by the way, with in Kabul at the time,
Mhm.
all the girls were wearing mini skirts. We were all
Yeah,
wearing mini skirts.
yeah,
Nobody harassed us. Nobody
yeah,
bothered
yeah.
us. They might have
Oh, yeah.
whistled at us. All the Iranian girls were in mini skirts. They were all working. They had jobs in the bank. They were behind the counter at the hotels. They were secretaries.
Yeah.
And
Oh, it's horrible.
it's terrible because it was a wonderful, it was a really fantastic place.
This is even at Afghanistan when I was there, and oh gosh, when I was there, 67, 68, the first time I was there. Again, it was this girls in miniskirts listening to Elvis Presley. You won't find it in any of the media. So the lack of awareness is one of the things I write constantly about.
This book is a new release and it's fantastic. And I'm hoping you'll get the necessary publicity that you need for it. But there are other books that you have written. And one of my favorite is The Last Savannah, because as I said, I love elephants. And since I was
Mhm,
a girl, I was interested in Africa. I would
mhm.
buy every book that had anything to do with Africa. It's a wonderful book. It's fantastic. And then, of course, you have
Thank you very much.
so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
and of course you have the Assassins, which is also a great book. You've done so much. I think you speak how many languages, because you've been there. What I get a lot of thrillers, and they're great, but so many times the people haven't actually been to these places. They read about them,
Oh, yeah.
they've done research, and sometimes it's good, but there's nothing like actually having been there. And I love your
Yeah.
stories about Africa, because obviously you've also loved your time there, and your wife and your family.
Oh, yeah. We lived in Kenya when the kids were young, and we wandered all over. We had a little Jeep that had almost no radiator at all, and we wandered all over. We slept with lions all around us. And one night we were sleeping in a little grove of trees, and a whole herd of elephants came through, and my wife and I were on cots on the ground, and two of the boys were in a tent, and the other boy was in the Jeep. And this huge female elephant came and stood right next to us, and they drink water all day. And so she took a pee, and that lasted 20 minutes. And it was hours before we could get out of our cots because the ground was so soaked. So I've done anti-poaching. I've helped to hunt down poachers in Africa. To return to what you just said, Patsy, that I don't write about anything that I haven't seen, and I don't write about places unless I've been there, unless I know exactly what that street corner looks like and exactly what that hill looks like, and because I've been there. So I totally concur. You shouldn't write about what you haven't seen.
Now, in The Last Savannah, of course, that was what was that? That was released a long time ago. I can't remember the
Yeah,
year.
yeah. It was first released in England, and published in England by a big publisher there, and then republished in the United States. And about, gosh, uh, I must have been in the late '90s when
So,
it first came out.
so it's been over 20 years. And I don't
Oh
think
yeah, it's
things have gotten better in Africa. I don't remember at that time how many elephants there were, but it's still going down. And I don't understand why. I would like to know, you're active in this area, why we have allowed this to continue. It really could be
the only
ended easily.
yeah, when I used to talk to the government in Nairobi, and I used to say, why don't you invite the United States Marines to come over and they're for war training, let them go after the poachers. And it would have been over in a week. Every poacher it would have been dead, and the elephants would have been safe. In the old days, just to give you a sense about what's been lost, in the old days, the elephants used to migrate all the way across East Africa, and in fact, West Africa too. And sometimes there would be a herd of elephants 50 miles long. 50 miles, that would be that many elephants working their way south through Kenya. And, and it's hard to imagine that many elephants because there's not many left.
I know. And
And
I love your idea of the Marines. I think that would be terrific. I have great faith in the Marines. They've saved my life
I do too.
twice. When I was in a sticky situation, there's nothing like seeing a U.S. Marine standing in front of an embassy or consulate, and then you're safe. I love
Oh, yeah.
Marines. And
Yeah.
that would actually be a great idea. But I think it's really so much easier. And I don't understand why the world hasn't just understood it. Most of all those a lot of the ivory trade comes here. Most of it is still in China. I would say, I don't know what percent. What do you think?
Yeah. 95% goes to China,
Oh,
China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand. Those
I
are,
don't understand how you can't end it. Just
well, at one point,
don't allow any of these people to come. Don't give them visas anywhere. If
yeah,
all the countries, if France and England and the United States, and they'd say, "Oh, you want to see the Mona Lisa? Forget it." Because last time I was in in the Louvre, half of it was Chinese tourists, and they spend a lot of money, but they're doing this horrible thing, and it would take 1 year if all of the countries, and particularly France, where they love to go, and England, where the, you go to Fortnum and Mason or you go to Harrods, you got a lot of tourists, and you say no visas for any of these people until they stop it, because what they're using it for is ridiculous. You don't need. It's crazy. It's
yeah.
simple. Why don't they just do that?
I when I lived in Kenya, for instance, the wife of the president of Kenya was the largest exporter of illegal ivory from Kenya to China. She made millions and millions of dollars doing that, and she was the wife of the president. So money talks, and money generally rules.
It does, but if they cannot travel to the countries they like to travel to, they can stop it. They can stop it. They don't have to buy this stuff, and it's cruel. It's just horrible what they're doing.
I remember related to the Chinese, and everybody has their own way of life. But I remember recently being in Russia just before the U.S. war broke out, U.S. Ukraine war, and the Russians have by far the world's greatest museums. And being in one of the great museums in Russia, and I think that was in St. Pete, but it might have been in Moscow. And there was so many Chinese that you could not make your way from room to room. It was like blocked with Chinese. They are interested in the rest of the world. They've made lots of good evolution. I think that the ivory purchase is are far less than they used to be, but it's still a problem, needless to
It's
say.
You have a website. It's called Mike Bond Books, right?
Yep.
But of course, your books are online and wherever books are sold, and hopefully bookstores, because I would put that right at the front door. It's so pretty. It's a great cover.
Thank you very much. That's a gentleman named Alan Dingman, Dingman, and he's a great artist, and he's done a number of my covers, and they're all unique. So
They are.
I'm very lucky to have him.
It is a great cover, very eye catching. Right away, you want to open it up, and then people, when you open it up, you'll have a wonderful story, wonderful characters, just memorable characters, which is what you want. You want characters that will stick with you long after, and I'm sure they all live in your head.
Oh,
Isn't
yeah.
it wonderful to be a writer and all the characters that are in that head of yours? They're all in there.
Yeah, it's endless. It's again, as I've said, I don't write about any place I haven't been, but I love people. I love individuals. I think humanity is in total has done a lot of damage to the world, obviously, but most individuals are charming and kind and are good people. That's what I write for. And we were talking a minute ago about the family and the importance of family, and it reminded me of that book Hillbilly Elegy that has been out. And it that again is talking about the importance, the incredible glue, the emotional glue that comes from being in a family and having children. And it's something that I feel a lot of the sorrow in the world would be diminished if people would spend more time thinking about their children and their grandchildren and the people they love.
Exactly, and making their lives a good example for their children,
Yes, good
and
point.
being there to teach them, to make sure that they learn early in life, and make sure they love reading and
Yeah,
discovery and
yeah,
all of the things
yeah.
that a good parent does. Now, speaking of joy, I want to talk to you about your book of poetry, which is called Joy, and perhaps you can come back and tell us more about that book. Okay.
Sounds wonderful, and I'm very grateful, Patsy. You've done a lot of wonderful things for the world of literature, and I thank you for that.
Thank you. And so we're going to say bye bye now to all of my viewers, and you and I are going to talk a little bit offline, okay?
Sounds great.
Okay.
Sounds great.
All right. Bye bye. Bye bye,
Bye
everybody.
bye.
And please get this book, it's fantastic. Thank you very much for watching. And it's been so much fun to talk to Mike Bond about his book, Crude. And meanwhile, would you please subscribe to Joy on Paper Live? Because I want to help authors promote their books. Whatever book you might have that you want to promote, get in contact with me. Please send me an email, info@joyonpaperlive.com. And remember, authors really appreciate getting comments. So leave your comment below. Thank you. Bye bye now.